Of all the mysteries in this world, cryptids, wormholes, simulations, etc., one of the most controversial topics remains the existence of aliens and alien abductions. So many people claim to have either been abducted or had alien encounters, yet so few are ever believed. However, the case of Travis Walton is definitely one of the most credible alien encounters to date. Not only was Travis witness to what happened, but 6 other men as well. What would follow would be an investigation unlike any other regarding aliens. The police and FBI alike would be involved, extensive searches would be launched to find Travis, lie detector tests would be given and passed. All parties involved had nothing to gain by telling their story, but rather everything to lose. And in a few cases, that's exactly what happened. These men gained fame for sure, but the wrong kind. Their careers ended, their families destroyed, yet every single one of them stood by their story. So now, you decide. The year was 1975, and in Snowflake, Arizona, Travis Walton had built somewhat of a reputation as a bad boy. He would ride his Harley-Davidson through town to ruffle the feathers of the locals. He was known for bull riding. He liked to fight, including, but not limited to, any man willing, and even purportedly taming a bear once. But for as many people as he would annoy, he was equally loved. Travis's profession at the time was a logger. He and his team were a smaller outfit that used hand tools like saws and axes to clear trees versus heavy equipment. Mike Rogers, the crew boss, who was present at the time of the alleged abduction, would say that the men he hired were all level-headed men. The work they were doing was very dangerous, therefore his crew had to be stable and have their acts together. There was no time for messing around and nonsense. They simply wouldn't have time or be the type to come up with this kind of a wild story. The crew were currently working on a big job to clear out 1,200 acres of national forest. They had been at it for 3 days at this point, and after another very long day and working well into the night, they decided to clock off. Mike Rogers and his crew of 6, which of course included Travis, all piled into his pickup truck and started the winding drive back down the access road. The forest was thick and dark, and the only light being the headlights of Mike's truck, until they came around a bend and noticed off to the right glowing lights in the woods. Not being informed of any other crews working in the area, the men discussed different possible sources, including the moon or fires, but ultimately and unanimously agreed to check it out. Taking another small side access road, the men drove down toward where the light was coming from, and once the trees opened up to show a small clearing, they were astounded by what they actually saw. All 7 would later be polygraphed. All 7 polygraphs were passed. All 7 men claimed to have seen the aircraft hovering in between 50 to 100 feet off of the ground. They described it as having panels of light circling the underbelly. The men would later say the whole incident was so surreal as this craft wasn't spinning or moving, but rather just floating, simply defying gravity. The craft was described as being very impressive in its structural design, a beautiful piece of work. While the cab of the truck was filled with awe and amazement, before it even came to a complete stop, Travis threw the door open and jumped out. He was making his way towards whatever this craft was. Everyone present was completely dumbfounded, including Travis, but that didn't stop him. He would later say during an interview that while he was scared, he was more intrigued and fascinated. Once the other men realized that Travis was walking towards this unidentified craft, they began calling for him to come back. They had a really bad feeling and a deep sense of dread. Of course, Travis didn't listen. He said he heard them calling, but he was far too fascinated to even consider turning around and going back to the truck. He said once he arrived close to the craft and he could get a better look at it, he was just struck by its absolute beauty. It was the most incredible piece of machinery he had ever seen. While he stood there looking at it, there was no way of recalling how much time had passed when the bottom of it slowly began to spin. Once the spinning began, the craft began emitting strange noises. They were described as a whirring and a grinding metal sound. And of course, once the other men heard that noise, they frantically began screaming for Travis to step away. But no one could predict what was going to happen. This thing could explode, it could crash to the ground. The possibilities were endless. Travis knew that he needed to turn around and walk away, but he would recall that he just, quote, needed, unquote, to look at it for a few more minutes. But just as he was about to turn and head back to the truck, a beam of light shot from underneath this craft and struck Travis almost like a lightning strike. The strike from this beam of light lifted him off the ground and blasted him 20 feet backwards. The men in the truck completely fell apart with panic. No one knew exactly what to do, so Mike Rogers, who was the crew leader and driver, did the only thing that he could think to do. He gunned it out of there. As they were flying down the side access road, they were convincing themselves that Travis absolutely must be dead. There was no way he could survive a strike like that, plus being thrown through the air. These grown men were hysterical. They were yelling and crying and had no idea what to do or what their next move should be. Again, those 6 men would all say the same thing on the polygraph tests, and all would pass. Once they reached the main road, they didn't make it very far when Mike hit the brakes. He announced that they just could not leave Travis in the woods, and they absolutely had to go back. He told the remaining crew if they wanted to stand on the road and wait for him that they were welcome to, but the truck was going back to get Travis. Once they made it back to the site, they very quickly realized there was no more glowing lights. The craft was gone, and despite a thorough search, so was Travis. The men were distraught. As they're running around the forest looking for Travis, they're upset, they're crying, they're beginning to shout at each other. No one really knew what was going on, and no one knew what had just happened. All they did know was that Travis was gone, and it was their fault for abandoning him. After a little bit of time searching, they knew they had to go to the police. There was nothing else that they could do. Travis was missing, and they needed help. Now, they also knew that going to the authorities was going to be very bad for them. Like, how could you explain what just happened? You can't just walk into a police station and say, hey, a UFO just zapped our friend and he disappeared. So as the men were driving down the road, they were in hysterics. There was confusion, there was anger. They didn't know how they were going to tell the authorities what happened. They just knew that they had to make it make sense. Ken Peterson, who was one of the crew members, was known as a very calm and level-headed guy, and while he was also most upset, he decided that he would be the one to do the talking. They drove until they came upon a payphone. Remember, now this is 1975, so Ken composed himself and called the police. He couldn't explain how their friend Travis was missing, but he told the police that it was just best that they come out to hear the entire story because trying to tell them over the phone would not do it justice. So after a little while, Sheriff Marion Gillespie and his partner Ken Copland would arrive on the scene. As Ken begins to explain what happened, the rest of the crew gradually climb out of the truck. They're obviously still upset, and it's clear they've been crying. Ken does not mention a UFO or alien or anything of that nature because no one at this point is sure of what they've even seen. He's just explaining to the sheriff that they were up logging and working in the woods, they saw this light, and now Travis is missing. Ken was saying how it's very hard to explain what happened when suddenly Mike Rogers jumps in and basically just shouts, "Listen, we saw a UFO, a beam of light came out and it shot Travis." So at this point, the sheriff is obviously thinking these guys are off their rockers. So he tells them that he needs to search their truck to make sure they're not under the influence of anything. And of course, they agree and step out of the way. The truck was clean. The field sobriety tests would show that all of the men were clean. Sheriff Gillespie, who was a huge skeptic, would later say during an interview that while he thought the story was completely nuts, the men were very clearly shaken and distraught about something. So the sheriff's gut instinct was that something absolutely did happen, but it was not extraterrestrial. He believed that these men were fabricating this wild story to cover up the true crime. He believed that these men had killed Travis Walton. So as the sun is coming up, Sheriff Gillespie has organized this search party and is up in the woods where this incident has supposedly taken place. Click the next video to continue the story.